Hanoi is the capital of Vietnam and it's full of culture, history, movement, colors, and delicious food everywhere. I'm back with part 2 of the series where I'm sharing my favorite places, moments, and adventures from the month that we spent in Southeast Asia. Hanoi was our starting point, but before I talk about it, this video will be divided in 3 topics. Number 1 will be history, number 2 will be practical information and advice, and number 3 are the highlights and best things that we did in Hanoi. Shall we? Let's talk about history. In case you don't know anything about Vietnam, I'll give you a very brief summary of their history for context. Throughout the centuries, Vietnam was colonized by China and more recently France, but it was also at war and it had military invasions from Japan and the USA. You can see Chinese and French influence in many aspects of everyday life, including the architecture that has elements from both cultures, the Vietnamese language that combines Chinese vocabulary but that is written in the Latin alphabet, and the food that incorporates Chinese dishes, seasonings, and techniques with French ingredients like butter, bread, pâté, and pastries. The French colonized Vietnam for about 100 years, from the 1850s until 1954, when the country was split in half. The north became the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and it was led by Ho Chi Minh, and the south was controlled by the US and their Western allies. It's common knowledge that the USA lost the Vietnam War. So in 1975, North Vietnam took control of the city of Saigon and were able to reunite the country. If you look at Vietnam on the modern map, you won't be able to see Saigon anymore. It was renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the reunification, but it's still common to hear the old name in conversations. After the reunification, Vietnam went through years of reconstruction and recovery from the war and the destruction caused by the USA. And finally, in the 1990s, it started to normalize relations with the West, and in the early 2000s, it opened up for global trade and economic growth. I know that not everyone will be interested in their history, but I think that having at least a brief understanding of the historical context of Vietnam really helps any visitor to have a much deeper and more authentic connection with the country. And I don't know about you, but that's how I like to travel. Now let's talk about some practical information and advice. If you look at Vietnam on a map, you'll see that it's a very long country. And when people talk about it, it's common to separate it into 3 different areas. The north, where you can find Hanoi, Ha Long Bay, Sapa, Ninh Binh, Ha Giang. Then the central area with Da Nang, Hoi An, and Hue. And the south with Ho Chi Minh City, they used to be known as Saigon, and the island of Phu Quoc. We didn't go to the south, but from the research that we did, what a lot of people do is they fly into Ho Chi Minh City and they start to explore the country from the south all the way up to the north. And in that way, you kind of leave the best for last, if that makes sense. Each region has their unique climate. In the north, you can kind of get all the 4 seasons, whereas in the central area and in the south, it's usually hot all the time. Another important thing to bear in mind is that rainy season doesn't happen at the same time in all 3 areas. And because of this, the best thing to do is to have some flexibility when you go to Vietnam. We traveled to Vietnam during typhoon season, and we had to change our plans a couple of times because of the intense rain and the flooding alerts for the regions where we were staying. Unfortunately, flooding is common during the rainy season in some areas of the country. Always check the weather apps and weather alerts and be open to changing your plan last minute if that makes you feel safer. In general, Vietnam is a very cheap country compared to most places. The national currency is the Vietnamese dong or VND. It's one of those currencies with astronomical numbers. For example, 1 pound converts to 35,000 dong, I think. You can eat really well on a budget of 10 pounds, dollars, or euros per day. But if you increase that a little bit, you can actually have incredible meals at really nice restaurants. I'd recommend that. As this was our first time in Vietnam, we didn't want the stress of relying on Wi-Fi until we could go and find somewhere to buy a local SIM We wanted to have internet from the moment that we landed. I downloaded the Airalo app and I bought a regional eSIM that covers 18 countries in Asia. It was super easy to activate and I had 5G signal everywhere we went, both in Vietnam and Thailand. They have lots of different options for specific countries or regions, and based on my positive experience, I definitely recommend them. We rented a studio apartment right in the heart of the old quarter. This is the most recommended area for first-time visitors. It's the super busy central neighborhood where you find lots of attractions, shops, restaurants, and a huge number of hotels and apartments to choose from. We paid £30, about 40 US dollars, which was an amazing deal. I did a quick room tour when we arrived, and this is what it looked like. Now let's talk about what to do in Hanoi. Starting from the most basic, budget-friendly option, walking around the streets of central Hanoi is a great way to have that first contact with Vietnamese culture. Traffic in the city center is a bit overwhelming if you're not used to it. There are motorbikes everywhere, and you can't really use the pavement because that's where the bikes are normally parked. And because there will be lots of small plastic stools outside the little restaurants and coffee shops where people just sit to have a meal. So forget about the pavement. You have to walk in the street with the cars and the motorbikes. Thankfully though, everyone seems to be super aware and going very slowly. It's doable. Scary but doable. One of my favorite things was how colorful the streets are, especially because of the thousands of Vietnamese flags that you'll see on some of the main roads, forming this red tunnel that you can just walk through. In fact, you can actually go on a day trip to a place that is known as the flag making village to see how they prepare the fabric and produce hundreds of those flags ahead of the national holidays. We didn't have time to go, but the place that I heard of was called Tu Van Village, if you'd like to check it out. We also booked a walking tour with a local guide for a few hours to show us around and teach us more about the history, culture, and architecture around the city. But we had to end it within an hour or so because I wasn't feeling very well. And being jet lagged at 35 degrees is no joke. I know this sounds obvious, but staying hydrated and getting a proper rest in the first few days, instead of trying to rush and do everything immediately, makes a huge difference. The Temple of Literature is a must-visit attraction. It was founded nearly 1,000 years ago in 1070 as a place of worship dedicated to Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, and it's known as Vietnam's first university. We paid 70,000 dong for the entry, £2 or 250 US dollars. Another highlight was the Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum. If you paid attention to the start of the video, you may remember that I mentioned Ho Chi Minh. He was a revolutionary politician who led the resistance movement against the colonial powers of France and the USA. He died in 1969, which means that he never actually got to see the reunification of Vietnam that only happened in 1975. But they built this mausoleum to be his resting place and a monument to honor his memory as a national hero and someone who fought and paved the way for the liberation of Vietnam. You can see the mausoleum for free, but I recommend visiting the whole complex. It's about 25,000 dong, which is less than $1. It includes the yellow house where he lived, where you can see some of his belongings. There's also a large green area around the mausoleum with over 250 plants and a pond, a stilt house where he spent his final years. It's very beautiful. Train Street is one of the most famous places in Hanoi. It's actually not just one place. You can see the train tracks running through several different streets, including these ones that you'll see somewhere on the screen. Best thing to do is to get there, grab a seat at one of the cafes, and have a drink or a snack until the train comes. Any of the staff from the cafes will be able to tell you when the next train is due. And if you're concerned about safety, as long as you follow their instructions when they move the tables and the chairs away from the train tracks, you'll be absolutely fine. Kiem Lake is one of the symbols of Hanoi, and the name, that means sword lake, is linked to the legend of a turtle that appeared to the king in the 15th century and basically told him to return the sword that the sea god had previously lent him. There's this tiny island on the lake where you can find the Ngoc Son Temple. Inside the temple, there is a model of said turtle, which is very impressive and interesting. Another thing that I loved about Hanoi and Vietnam in general was the food. There's lots of street food tours that you can book, or you can just spend your afternoons and evenings going to local restaurants and trying different dishes. Everything is delicious. I did not have a single bad meal in Vietnam, like at all. My favorite dishes were banh mi, which is a sandwich made with meat, salad, herbs, pickles in this very light and crispy baguette. Pho, which is the noodle soup with broth, rice noodles, meat and fresh herbs. Hanoi spring rolls are delicious. They're deep fried and they're filled with pork and shrimp, glass noodles, carrots and mushrooms, and it's wrapped in rice paper before they deep fry it. Then bun cha was also a favorite. Comes with grilled meat, usually pork, then separately cold rice noodles, salad, and then a dipping sauce. And the way you eat it is you get some of the meat, the noodles, and the salad in one go with your chopsticks. Then you dip it all in the sauce and eat it. It's incredible. Vietnam is also a great place for coffee lovers. You can join coffee making workshops or tours where they will teach you how to make their famous egg coffee, but they also have salt coffee, coconut coffee, and the traditional Vietnamese coffee. As I was preparing this video, I realized that I never actually tried egg coffee, which is a fantastic excuse to go back. Some people say that it's hard to find places in Vietnam that will serve cold beer, but maybe that's a problem in small cities or villages, because every single beer that we had was ice cold. And trust me, we had quite a few. I'm not a massive fan of partying and nightlife, but I had a glimpse of what that looks like in Hanoi when I went to Beer Street. It's a very busy place, full of entertainment, bars, karaoke, restaurants, pubs, you name it. If that's your thing, you should 100% check it out. You'll love it. If I had to define Hanoi in one sentence, I would say it's a place that makes you feel alive. There's so much life happening in the streets. There's colors everywhere. You can smell fresh food being prepared at the local restaurants 24/7. It's loud, vibrant, and exciting in every possible way. I would 100% recommend it as a travel destination if you like any of the topics that I talked about in this video. If you want to learn and see more of Vietnam from my perspective, my next video will be about Ninh Binh, which is probably the coolest, most beautiful and incredible place I've ever been to. See you soon.